I welcome everybody. I'm Michael Makovsky. I'm the president and CEO of the, excuse me, of the Jewish Institute for National Security of America. Welcome to this JINSA webinar, Building a Budget for an Increasingly Dangerous World. I was one of the core principles at JINSA is that the United States needs to have a strong U.S. military and a strong U.S. National defense posture. Today we're going to talk about the budget. Obviously, it's one of the most, it's a core, it's a fundamental objective. One of the most important purposes, if not the most important purpose of the federal government is to provide, as the Constitution says, for a common defense. President Biden, amid rising tensions, obviously the Russian invasion of Ukraine, rising regional aggression, and over 8% inflation rate. President Biden recently asked Congress provided a budget of $813 billion for defense next year, which is roughly about a 4% increase, nominal increase over the 2022 spending. To discuss this, the defense budget issues, we're very honored to have to welcome Congresswoman Elaine Luria, a Democrat of Virginia, and Congressman Mike Waltz, Republican of Florida, with us today, and also Ambassador Eric Edelman to moderate. Representative Luria represents Virginia's 2nd Congressional District. She serves on the House Armed Services Committee, the House Committee on Homeland Security, and the House Committee on Veteran Affairs. She also has served, prior to her service in Congress, she served 2 decades in the Navy, retiring at the rank of commander. I believe of all the members of the House Democratic Caucus, she is currently in Congress. She has served the longest on active duty in the military, and we obviously appreciate very much her service. Congressman Mike Waltz represents Florida's 6th Congressional District. He also serves on the House Armed Services Committee, most notably as the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Readiness and as a member of the Strategic Forces and Intelligence and Special Operations Subcommittee. Representative Waltz also served a long time in the military, served over 24 years in the U.S. Army, and is presently serving in the National Guard. He is the first Green Beret to be elected to Congress. We welcome you both very much, and I also want to just welcome our good friend Ambassador Eric Edelman, counselor at JINSA's Gmunder Center for Defense and Strategy. Eric co-chairs our Iran Policy Project, as well as our Eastern Mediterranean Policy Project. Eric is a former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy and also is a former co-chair of the National Defense Strategy Commission, and he has served in other senior positions in government. I'm going to turn it over to Eric to continue this discussion. Again, thank you very much for joining us, and we're very honored, Representative Luria and Representative Waltz, for joining us this morning. Thank you. Go ahead, Eric.
Thank you, Mike. It's great to be here with all of you this morning. And before I start, I've got a long list of questions. I want to try and do the questions with the two of you until about 9:45, at which point we'll open the floor to Q&A from those who are watching this webinar. But I'd like to begin first by thanking both of you, not only for your military service, but your service on the House Armed Services Committee, which traditionally in the Congress has been one of the most bipartisan committees. And I think it's in the national interest that we continue to have bipartisan support for strong national defense. And in today's day and age, service in Congress is not as much fun as it used to be. And I want to thank both of you for what you do for the nation every day. So thank you for that. I'd like to start really with a philosophical question about how the two of you see the role of congressional oversight of the Department of Defense. I mean, the Constitution mandates that those of you in Congress have as an obligation providing for the common defense. There are lots of other optional things you can do with regard to interstate commerce and other things, but you're obligated to provide for the common defense. And it seems to me that Congress over the last decade and a little plus has been both the source of problems for the Department of Defense and part of the solution. I say part of the problem because, of course, the Budget Control Act of 2011 imposed a lot of hardship on the Department of Defense. And there was a period of a lot of defense cuts, even though a lot of us outside of government were warning about the increasingly difficult international security environment we were facing. The Trump administration, after the BCA was repealed, did increase defense by about 3% in real terms for the first 2 years, but was pretty flat in the last 2 years of the administration. And Congress, to its credit, plussed up the first Biden budget. So how do you see the role of your role as oversight as members of the House Armed Services Committee from a philosophical point of view? And let me start with you, Representative Luria, and then to you, Representative Waltz.
Well, thank you for the question. And, this is one of the things that sort of struggle with a lot on a regular basis, especially within my caucus, to really try to elevate the importance of defense, the importance of our role as Congress in providing for defense and, these competing challenges between domestic and other spending versus the discretionary spending for the Department of Defense. And, when the president's budget came over last year, it was clear that it didn't have the 3 to 5% real growth that we needed to see. And, I, along with some of my colleagues, got to work right away, but I'll tell you that I was really kind of, at first felt like I was working on my own on my side of the aisle. I kind of went behind the chairman of the committee's back, worked with Ranking Member Mike Rogers, Republican from Alabama, and the Senate added 25 billion roughly. The timing was that we came after the Senate in that process, but we also matched that. And, I think that was an incredibly important additional investment. But when you talk about the role of oversight, I feel, and I've talked a lot about this over my last 3.5 years in Congress, is that, when the Department of Defense comes to us, I think they do a really poor job of outlining their strategy and really within that, the risk associated with the budget that they're proposing. I feel like the whole process is backwards. Essentially, there's a top line that's established. It's broken down by each service. Each service comes to Congress and they kind of come and say, like, here's the best we can ask for with what we think you're going to give us, rather than the other way around, saying, like, here are the threats in the world. This is what we need. And, something you can look to, for example, is the 1980s maritime strategy under President Reagan with Secretary Lehman as the Secretary of the Navy. This is what we need to defeat the Soviet Union. So let's look at it. We need this many ships in the Mediterranean, this many in the North Atlantic, the Pacific. Ends up to be 15 carrier battle groups. That's 600 ships. And the entire nation, with the support of the president and everyone on down in government, got behind that plan, and we essentially built a 600 ship Navy. But what was key in that discussion was, like, here's the risk if you don't do it. And I feel like that is part of the discussion that's missed within Congress. And, it really should be a strategy that drives requirements, and then those requirements drive the POM and the budget. But I feel like the whole cycle is backwards. And I just, feel like I continue to keep, pushing back on that. Tell us what the risk is. Tell us why you need these things. Be a lot more clear about the consequences of us not making these investments, and really just come to us and tell us what you actually need, rather than just what you think you can fit in this top line. So I'll stop there and pass it over to Mike.
Well, yeah, thanks, and well said by Elaine. And I just want to really throw her a compliment as a colleague and a bipartisan member on the Armed Services Committee. I have to say, being on Armed Services kind of keeps me sane in terms of the work that we're doing. It's important, it's substantive, it's often bipartisan. I think Elaine has a far harder job, I hope she doesn't mind me saying so, within her caucus, of really, than I do within mine, of really elevating the importance of defense, the importance of a national, a strong, robust national defense strategy that's fully resourced, but also the U.S.-Israel relationship and how vital that is. So really, my hat's off to you, Elaine, and it's been it's really been good working with you. To your point, Ambassador Edelman, I was just recalling an oversight hearing with, members of the Navy and our Pacific Fleet and Pacific Command, Indo-Pacific Command. And actually Representative Loria was lamenting that we've been asking quite some time for the actual strategy. Is it fully resourced? Do you have the authorities you need? Can we, number one, deter a Chinese, any type of CCP invasion of Taiwan? But do we then have the resources and authorities to execute if deterrence fails? She was very frustrated. I echoed her frustration. We get a lot of head nods that we have what we need, but then from the Pentagon, but then the next year, we're kind of, it's a cyclical and frustrating process of then going right back to where the gaps are. So I think that oversight role, yes, Congress is part of the problem many times. We all have parochial interests, but I can go throughout history. And Senator John McCain was, I think, one of the most aggressive about this, of really holding the Pentagon to account we can go back to the Littoral Combat Ship. We can go through program after program that we poured billions into that didn't meet the need, didn't get the taxpayer what they deserved. And I think, Congress really holding in an oversight role the Pentagon's feet to the fire is incredibly important. At the same time, the two famous words, Ambassador Edelman, from your time in the Pentagon that you'll remember is Congress will never allow this, or Congress is demanding this, right? Depending on the agenda, the agenda at play. So it's part of our system. It's a healthy back and forth. I'm convinced, as a member of Congress, if you understand how the building works, how it's organized, and really take the time to invest to understand the process between OMB, the services, the Office of Secretary of Defense, and Congress, and your name's not going to be over, all over groundbreaking legislation, but you can really get some important things done in the defense bill, either pushing the services and Pentagon or helping them, because it is a bill that has passed every year for 61 years. And, finally, I'll say, and this is really evident in working with Representative Loria, it matters having veterans on the Defense Committee. It really does. And we've gone in 1978, 75% of the Congress, both House and Senate, 3/4 were vets. Today, it's hovering around 15, 16%, record low in our nation's history. And I really think, and that's no dispersion on any of our colleagues, it is just an incredibly steep learning curve. It's a steep learning curve for any of us to really take it all in and be able to understand and make a difference. But you could certainly, I think it's evident in those who have served, that kind of, it's not the question you ask, it's that second and third to really be able to drill down and ask the tough questions and hold people to account. It's incredibly important. That I'll stop too. I think we could go on this because it's both frustrating and very rewarding.
Oh, and I agree, obviously, with everything both of you have said about the importance of the back and forth and the importance. Look, when I was undersecretary, it was painful to go up and testify. It was a pretty contentious time, but I always understood that there was a huge benefit to doing it. Representative Luria, was music to my ears when you talked about 3 to 5% growth, because of course that's the metric we used in the National Defense Strategy Commission that I co-chaired back in 2018 with Gary Roughead, the former CNO. So let's dig into the current budget. I will tell you, my personal view is, given what we've seen in the world, and certainly given the Russian invasion of Ukraine, with unprovoked, premeditated, highly scripted, war of aggression, not a war of choice. It's a war of aggression. We should, I think, make clear. To me, 5% now seems more in order than 3%. The budget that the Biden administration submitted, I'd like to get both of your sense of how it stacks up against, the notion of a strategy. You are all at a little bit of an advantage over the rest of us because the administration has actually submitted a classified version of the National Defense Strategy. The unclassified version has not yet been published. But we now have an inflation rate of 8.5%. In the first budget that the Biden administration submitted, there was no FYDP in that first budget, but they did have a placeholder for future budgets of 0.5% growth, which already with the inflation rate at that time seemed low. They're now directing the Pentagon to assume an ongoing inflation rate of 2.2%, and spending is going to increase to $813 billion, which is a 4% boost over what you all enacted last year. Now that's in a context where non-defense discretionary spending is growing by 12% per year, which is obviously about 3 times the rate of growth that we see in the Biden defense budget. So my question to you is famous question that Robert McNamara, asked of the Department of Defense: how much is enough? I'm going to put, is this enough in your view to defend the nation against the threats that we see out there? And I'll start with you, Representative Lurie.
Well, as one might expect, I'll focus in on some things specific to the budget about the Navy, and I'll just throw some numbers out there for those who maybe haven't tracked this part as closely. This budget, while we're looking at the potential for China to try to take Taiwan by force, we heard Admirals Davidson and Aquilino say that it's very highly likely within the next 6 years. That was a year ago, so now 5 years. And we have a budget here when just focusing in on the Navy seeks to decommission 24 ships and only build 8. There is a huge push, I think, within this administration, within the DoD under its current leadership, to divest to invest. The idea that all of the capabilities that we have today, many of, maybe not all, but many are these legacy platforms that, in the mind of those who want to create the force of the future, these buzzwords, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, they're all technologies we need to invest in and learn how to adapt. But without the actual platforms, without the ships, without the VLS cells, without the capability for long range strike, none of those things can actually be used to any real effect. And so, I did some math and looked at the number of VLS cells that we're going to lose, for example, between now and 2035. We are going to lose 2,300 VLS cells. That is more than all of our European allies combined have in all of their fleets.
Those are vertical launch systems.
Yes, so vertical launch cells. So those carry our long range strike missiles, Tomahawk missiles with approximately 1,000 nautical mile range. They carry missiles for air defense capability, as well as ASROC, which is a torpedo that can be launched from VLS as far as anti-submarine warfare. But the fact is that they're focusing in on sort of 3 things. It's readiness, capability, and capacity, and trying to put readiness in front of everything. But if you have a ready force but a gutted force, you don't have the force that you need in order to accomplish your goals. And I don't want to beat the dead horse over the strategy issue, but going back to the newest national defense strategy and comparing that in broad terms without going into sort of the classified details of the new version we've reviewed, is I think there's a big diversion from the last administration to this administration as what type of deterrence we want to have a force to accomplish. I think it was very clear under the Trump administration that we were trying to build a force that could do deterrence by denial. And when you think about denial, that's what can we do to deny the Chinese the ability to invade and take over Taiwan. This seems to be more of a deterrence by punishment, like we're going to come in after the fact, and what kind of weapons and high-end capabilities are necessary for that. And I've said it many times that I think that quantity has a quality of its own. I think that the number of ships that we have, our continuous presence within the Indo-PACOM AOR, our ability to complicate the problem for the Chinese and to put their forces at risk. And it's really all about a calculation of their will. What is their will to actually try to go forward with potentially trying to take Taiwan by force? So, do we have a deterrent? Do they think it's actually not possible because we're there and they're at risk? Or are we counting on the fact that they think that the punishment on the other side of it is going to be too great? Like, we're not going to do this because the consequences will be too great. So this national defense strategy really leans in on this idea of integrated deterrence. And our colleague Mike Gallagher, if you've watched the hearings, has really hammered away, what is this integrated deterrence? How does it work? Was it effective with regards to Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine? And so I really think that we have a lot of hard questions to ask in Congress. Are you abandoning the idea of deterrence by denial? And is that why you're gutting the force and reducing the number of platforms? So in my opinion, the answer is no. This does not build the force that we need, either in the near term, especially in the near term, with regards to our current threats. And, when you talk about the long term, and a 30-year shipbuilding plan just came out, anything past year 5 and certainly past year 10 is very aspirational and, will change as time goes on. So, I'm very discouraged by what I've seen so far this year in the process of the NDAA.
I want to come back to the 30-year shipbuilding program that the department released yesterday, I guess. But I want to go to Representative Waltz, and then I want to come back to both of you with a very specific question about deterrence. But Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I think the existential threat, or the existential really question of our time, is how do we, and I hate saying, I don't even like the term pacing threat. I don't want to pace any threat. I want to outpace and outmatch. But how do we outmatch China, continue to deal with at least from a nuclear standpoint, a dangerous Russia, overlaid, with North Korea and that ticking time bomb there, Iran racing towards a nuclear weapon, and then potentially an outbreak of a nuclear arms race in the Middle East, and a still very dangerous and now growing in danger global terrorism threat that is festering in what I'm calling the Taliban caliphate. How do we do all of those things overlaid with 30 trillion in debt and climbing? I don't think this budget does it. The comptroller admitted in our last posture hearing that he used a 4% figure. He wouldn't say whether that came from OMB or if that was internal, but regardless, this budget moves backwards. Just in terms of the top line, I wholeheartedly agree with Elaine that we are not doing ends, ways, and means. We're doing that. We're doing it backwards. I'll say on deterrence, the integrated deterrence failed when it comes to deterring Putin in Ukraine. I think we need to acknowledge that, embrace it, look at it with open eyes, and apply it to Taiwan. I agree with her as well that having a tough, unified global response after a city like Taipei is leveled it isn't a strategy that we want to resource. And then finally, I would just say that from the Navy standpoint, I share the concerns. We have to get out of this either or model. It's either readiness or capacity, or it's readiness now, lethality later. As now the ranking member on the readiness subcommittee, I could tell you we have a I don't want to call it a crisis, but we have a real problem with readiness across all of our services. But I think it's particularly acute in the Navy right now. They're attempting to get at it, but I don't think they're adequately describing the risks down the road. And to Admiral Davidson's point, if you buy into the 2027 timeline, basically what we're buying now, or what we're divesting of now, is what we'll have for 5 years from now. I mean, this is our potential go to war force. And I think that is incredibly concerning. We continue every year that I've been here of the divest to invest, which creates a dip. But that dip continues year after year. And so I keep waiting on coming out of it. When do we come out of it with those investments coming to maturity, and then getting to a quantity that we can actually deter adversaries? And I'm just not seeing it right now.
I mean, I heartily agree with both of you. I mean, for years and years, we've been in this, capacity capability trap where we reduce capacity allegedly in order to invest in future capabilities, which, as Representative Luria said, 30 years from now, that's great. But as Keynes said, in the long run, we're all dead. You got to live through the short and medium term, be able to get to those future capabilities. And if we don't have an adequate top line, in my view, we'll end up doing a bad job of both, actually, which is, I think, where we're headed.
Can I jump in for a second?
Please. Yeah.
And it's not always just about the top line, going back to the idea of like, let's define clearly the strategy. What are the most important things that we can invest in? And there's always this reticence to invest in what some might see as like lower end capabilities. But what are we doing for offensive mining? That's a really inexpensive capability that is really important in deterring an amphibious invasion of Taiwan. But I asked the Chief of Staff of the Air Force last year, what are your investments in offensive mining and long range anti-surface missiles, LRASM? And those were not even things, kind of on the briefing sheet for the hearing that were even high enough in priority order for them to be able to, come to us at the hearing and talk about those investments. So, I think it really is refocusing. It's not always on the most expensive high-end things, but it's fitting into like, where do the capabilities fit into the strategy and what things can we invest in that can give an outsized amount of capability and capacity for the investment. So I'll pass it back over there.
No, I agree. And from the point of view of sort of integrated deterrence, if that's what you want to call it, but frankly, for any kind of deterrence, you have to have some kind of operational concepts that show how you're going to use the things you're investing in to actually defeat the enemy if deterrence fails, because that's the way you deter them, that make them not want to go to war because they're going to lose. And we've had a shortage of that kind of thinking for a very, very, very long time, I'm afraid. And I don't see much progress in the current what one can make out of the current NDS as it's emerging. Let me go to one very specific thing, and it's a Navy thing, but it's also a nuclear thing, which is the TLAM-N. So we don't have the nuclear posture review yet, but it's clear from the budget that the TLAM-N is going to be that's a Tomahawk land attack missile with a nuclear warhead on it, is going to be a casualty, a submarine launch cruise missile. And in the light of all these nuclear threats of theater weapon use by Russia, just the other day, Foreign Minister Lavrov said that Russia has no plans to use theater nuclear weapons against Ukraine yet, he said, which holds out the possibility that it might be willing to do so in the future. And since Lavrov has lied about everything else he said, one can't take much comfort even in the statement he made. Does it make sense to be killing one of the few capabilities we would have to be able to match on the escalation ladder the Russian threats to use theater nuclear weapons, or in a future Taiwan contingency, since I'm sure the Chinese are going to school on what's going on in Ukraine, a future Chinese threat to use theater nuclear weapons against Taiwan or against the fleet in a Taiwan contingency.
Do you want me to start on this one? So
yeah, if you wouldn't mind
I'll
starting.
defer to you on that one, Elaine. I mean, I have my thoughts, but I'm sure you.
Well, and I think 2 years ago, this was a big debate in the NDAA, and it appears that it's something that we'll be considering again. So I will start out first by saying unequivocally, the nuclear deterrent is the cornerstone of our national defense. Our largest investment that we are making is for the Columbia class submarine in order to make sure that we can, update that leg of the nuclear triad for submarine launched ballistic missiles. And even as we went through continuing resolutions this year, I'll tell you that final continuing resolution, it only got across the finish line because the funding was put in there as an anomaly to make sure that Columbia could stay on track. So I don't want to have any doubt whatsoever that, I believe that remains the cornerstone of our national defense. We need to make those investments in upgrading all three legs of the nuclear triad. As far as this particular missile and particular capability, I mean, we do with our dual capable aircraft stationed in Europe and other capabilities, have the ability to do theater I'm sorry, I'm losing the exact words. But we do have the capability to do nuclear weapons, within the theater from our dual capable aircraft in Europe. And so, I mean, developing this capability, it's something I have to go back and look at again. I mean, the TLAM-N was something that, we had back in the 80s, about the time that I came into the Navy. We were, phasing out that capability, and just really need to look and see and evaluate like what the cost benefit of that capability is. And obviously our hope with a deterrent is that we never reach that level of escalation, but we certainly are with Russia's unprovoked aggression and invasion of Ukraine. We're in a very different situation than the Cold War, where you have nuclear power versus nuclear power. You have a nuclear power who is overrunning a non-nuclear power, and essentially NATO and the rest of the world, at bay because of this threat of a potential escalation using these theater nuclear weapons. And so, I think it's really a case study that we have in Ukraine that we need to look at and understand how does that apply in a China-Taiwan related scenario. And we haven't gotten there yet, but I'm sure that Iran is watching very carefully to see and understand, not that they didn't before, but the implications of having the capability for a nuclear weapon and what type of sort of leverage that has given Putin. So I'll just say, I think that this is something that we'll be debating more in this year's NDAA, and I'm open to both sides of the debate. I just think it needs to be analyzed versus other competing priorities and the cost benefit of that particular weapon.
Eric, I'll just jump in there. If we're seeing, to Elaine's point, if we're seeing what how Putin can deter us with particularly with low yield nuclear weapons, where they do have an escalate to de-escalate. They do believe they can use low yield, and we won't dare respond by starting World War III, and therefore they can get away with it. If that scares us, then Iran having that capability should petrify all of us with what they believe they could get away with as they develop a nuclear deterrent. Look, I don't get it. I mean, the Secretary of Defense, in terms of TLAM-N or TLAM-N, right? Whichever you want to talk about, but the Secretary is testified that basically the juice isn't worth the squeeze in terms of the investment and the capability that you get. And I think we're just going to have to dive deeper. I know that the 2018 Nuclear Posture Review recommended restoring that capability through SLCM-N, the Sea Launch Cruise Missile Navy, and then the Biden budget put R&D towards it, but now they want to cancel it. And beyond there, we're going to have to keep digging. I mean, we still don't have all the details of the budget, by the way.
Yeah, and I believe that both the Stratcom commander and the chairman have testified that it's still a valid requirement. So something that's worrying me, and I wonder if it's worrying you and what you and your oversight capacities can do about it with the budget, is the depletion of U.S. munitions stocks because of Ukraine. I mean, I've seen some estimates that we've transferred perhaps as much as a third of our Javelin holdings. Stinger, of course, doesn't have an active production line, and we've transferred a lot of those. You read accounts. I know that Kath Hicks has met with defense industry to figure out what they can do to accelerate production, to replenish stocks, but we're going to be in a position not only of providing these stocks to Ukraine, but also replenishing stocks, making our allies whole who are providing Soviet-era equipment to Ukraine. So this looks like it's going to go on, for a long time. We're now talking about, when it comes to 155 millimeter rounds, thousands and thousands of rounds. And depending on how long this goes, right now I know people aren't worried about artillery stocks, but you could imagine a circumstance in which that would be a problem. And one of the things we found on the commission 4 years ago is that the defense industrial base is actually not very well situated to surge production, because there's competition for floor space for all the munitions. You can't say, give me more of everything, because it's the same plants that are building these things. They're actually physical limits. And that's before you get to the supply chain issues that we're all running into with regard to chips and other components that go into this. So how do you all think about this? What can the Congress do to make sure that, for instance, if we find ourselves in a Taiwan contingency, and I recognize that there are different munitions that would probably be involved in that, but how do we make sure we've got enough munitions in our own stocks to meet our own needs? And Representative Luria.
Sure. Well, I was going to actually push over to Mike to start on this, being the ranking member on readiness and also an Army guy. But, I'd say these are very valid questions that we are asking. I mean, we are looking to see, because of what has been expended and, passed along either directly to Ukraine or to our NATO allies to backfill in support of that conflict, what are the additional investments that are necessary? How is that going to change the submission of this year's budget, and not only in like this year, but over coming years? And as you mentioned, the industrial base, is not necessarily poised to surge rapidly to start manufacturing things that they're not currently manufacturing, or to expand the production line of other things. So all very valid questions that I know are on my mind as we continue through these hearings for this year's defense bill. And I'll pass it over to you, Mike.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's important to point out that the supplementals really started at least getting at backfilling our munitions. That 13 billion, a good portion of it was dedicated to replenishment, not necessarily additional drawdown for Ukraine. So I expect to see an additional supplemental request, because they've essentially already spent both in drawdown and in backfilling our stocks, the first one. So I would not be surprised in the coming month to see another supplemental getting at the stocks. But, to our earlier discussion, buying more rounds and buying, making sure our depots are topped off, it always falls to the bottom of the list, it seems, with the services. It's not new. It's not a shiny new capability. It's essentially, as Elaine was saying, investing in stuff that gives us capability and capacity and lethality now. And it's okay to invest in low tech. And to your point, for example, the Harpoon anti-ship missile that has been in the inventory since the late 70s and has really been phased out, is exactly what Ukraine was begging for last year. They used, their own variant, the Neptune, to take down the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, the Moskva, and Taiwan has been, practically begging for them for years. But because of production issues, which we still have to get to the bottom of, they're not due to receive them until 2025, at least an initial tranche. So that means full operating capability to probably 26 or 27. That's too late. Same with the Stingers. So I think you're absolutely right, Ambassador. We've got to take a harder look at these, keeping some of these, and it's always been a criticism of Congress, frankly, that we keep some of these supply and production lines open to outfit our allies. It was a criticism of Congress that was really just parochial interest overriding, the new things that the Pentagon needs. But we've seen some of these capabilities really need to stay alive. And then finally, you're also hitting a nail on the head in terms of our surge capacity. I spent a year on a supply chain task force, and we do not have access to the lithium, to the cobalt, to the graphite, to the rare earth minerals that make our modern military go. China has deliberately cornered the market and have explicitly threatened to shut off those access to those critical minerals. And yet, for example, Canada just last month sold their largest lithium mine with the national security review that we can't get to the bottom of either in coordination with the administration, to a Chinese state-owned enterprise. I mean, it really makes your head want to explode. And at the same time, the Army just outlined a strategy to take our combat vehicles all electric. And I certainly support a diverse energy source. We need that. But to take them all electric by 2050 yet nothing in the strategy talks about securing those supply chains, much less the debate of having the most lethal vehicle on the battlefield, not the least carbon emitting. So yeah, we have a lot of work to do. And to our first question, in terms of oversight and pressing the building, I think this is a place where we can really be effective as a committee.
So, Representative Luria, I want to go back to something you've said at the outset, which I think is very important, which is, the budget has to, be in service of a strategy. More typically in the last few years, we hear our Pentagon colleagues say, well, the budget's informed by the strategy as opposed to in service of a strategy. So there are two elements here that I think kind of big geopolitical elements that are strategic that, you have to ask, does the budget, serve these objectives? And one would be, we're in a pretty unprecedented period in the history of U.S. national security, which is that we're not just dealing now with one peer competitor like we did in the Cold War with the Soviet Union. We're dealing with two near peers, Russia and a rising China. So we have to take into account, and Ukraine, I think, has thrown this into pretty sharp relief, the potential that we might end up having a conflict, with both at the same time. And, the 2018 National Defense Strategy basically was a pretty explicit one war strategy. We were going to fight one war and try and deter the other near peer with our nuclear deterrent. Now, does that suffice? Does this budget allow us to deal with, conflict coming from both of these rivals at the same time? And more broadly, does it enable us to maintain a balance of power, military power, favorable to the United States in Europe, in the Indo-Pacific, and in the Middle East? There has clearly been a predisposition to say we can take risk in the Middle East. And now that we're out of Afghanistan, although the way we got out was pretty catastrophic, that certainly diminished some of the draw on our resources, albeit it's left us, as Representative Waltz was saying, a little bit blind when it comes to the counterterrorist threat. So does this budget, do that? And how do you see those strategic problems informing your role in overseeing the budget?
Well, I could give a very short answer. My answer is no, I don't think it does that. And I know you wanted to wrap this section up at 9:45. So, no, but, what I would say is, the National Defense Strategy from the previous administration to address this issue of simultaneity. And as you said, it talked about being able to fight one major conflict and deter elsewhere. I think that we can come to realize that these things are, as they always have been, but they're very interconnected. We don't focus a lot, particularly on Russia and Russia's forces in the Far East. But when you look at Russia and China doing joint naval exercises circumnavigating Japan last year, and sort of this nebulous dance between China and Russia and what is their level of cooperation and kind of what level of Russian propaganda and messaging is being replicated within China, and what is China doing to observe what's happening in Ukraine and looking at this as an example and a template of how they might move forward and how they might assess the US and our allies' will to intervene or actually serve as a deterrent. Probably a much longer conversation, but we have spent a lot of the time today talking about China and Taiwan. And, I do think we need to look at the policy of strategic ambiguity, which has been our policy since 1979. I truly do think we're at a point that we should move past that. But in order to do that and say that the United States will act to come to the defense of Taiwan in order to maintain the status quo, you have to have a force that can do that. And this budget is not investing in that force today. So probably the shortest way I can answer that. And that obviously neglected a true discussion of what our resources need to be committed within Europe, and especially within the Middle East, because we certainly have drawn down especially our naval presence. A continuous carrier strike group presence in the Gulf, is no longer something that we are implementing, and understanding sort of what the trade-offs are there, and what investments need to be made.
Representative Waltz, and then we'll go to the Q&A. For those in the audience, please put your questions in the Q&A box, and I will curate them as we go forward. We've already got one.
Just quickly agree with everything Representative Loria just said. And I'll just talk China and then the Middle East. And I think the important point for us to all keep in mind with the CCP is their theory of victory isn't a World War III type of conflict of plane on plane, tank on tank, ship on ship. Their theory of victory is us not being able to afford to compete any longer and essentially stepping aside as the Russians did in the 1980s, and for us to essentially bankrupt ourselves. And so we're spending a lot of time on the committee looking at domestic production, looking at onshoring, working with financial services and other committees on the amount of capital flow that is flowing out of Wall Street and out of multinationals into Beijing, their theft of our intellectual property and our key technologies. We're about to enter into a conference with the USICA, or the China Competes Bill, of which I'll be a conferee. I was the ranking member on research and technology. And we cannot continue to pour money into our R&D only to watch it flow right out the back door into Beijing and for them to launch new capabilities. So that's one. And then on the Middle East, we absolutely are accepting risk, but then our policies are compounding the risks. We now have, an axis of terrorism from the Mediterranean through Hezbollah, through ISIS, through the Iranian regime, their proxies in Iraq, and now a Taliban caliphate with both ISIS and Al-Qaeda clearly demonstrating the intent to attack us again and developing the capability, yet we're pulling force posture out and on the verge through the JCPOA of pouring billions in to our adversary that will absolutely destabilize the region. So while on the one hand, I could accept a clear articulation of the risk in terms of military force posture and the global posture review, what I can't wrap my mind around is then compounding that risk with our broader policy, whether it be JCPOA or not leaving a residual force in Afghanistan or not fully supporting, our greatest ally in the region, Israel. I mean, those two juxtaposed to me just are nonsensical.
Well, I held off on raising the JCPOA questions because I was pretty sure they would come up in the Q&A from the audience. And in fact, Representative Waltz, you kind of gotten to the first one, which is, does it make sense to be lifting, handing over billions, to Iran? And I would add, at the price potentially of delisting the IRGC. And there's a specific question in here directed at you, Representative Luria. You talked about the difficulties in your own caucus about getting a sufficient attention on national defense. Do you feel you've made some progress? I mean, my sense is that there are more members of your caucus who are skeptical now of the JCPOA, and in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, more open to the argument that we need stronger national defense.
Yes. So the answer is, I've been very vocal about this. I was not in Congress, when the initial JCPOA was implemented, but, I think that the Iran deal was a bad deal and I wouldn't have voted to support it. And I've continued that, especially into the ongoing negotiations that we are observing today. I came together with a group of over a dozen of my Democratic colleagues, and we put out a press release. We did a small press event to clearly articulate our opposition to what we understand could be some provisions of attempting to re-enter the JCPOA. And also in hearings that we've had with the CENTCOM commander recently, I echoed some of my similar concerns about the fact that, were we to allow Iran to have additional resources, that's going to obviously flow to their proxy organizations, Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis. It's going to sow, more danger within the region, make the region less safe, and certainly put at risk our closest ally within the region, which is Israel. So, I think that this administration has not actually lifted any of the sanctions from the previous administration, but all of the things that are, being considered on the table for these negotiations, I think are extremely dangerous. One front and foremost is this idea of removing a terrorist designation from the IRGC, which I think maybe in some part our public statements have, caused the administration to respond that that's not on the table now. But we'll continue, and along with my colleagues on my side of the aisle and in a bipartisan way, speaking out against something that we think could be a dangerous deal that could make the world, the Middle East, less safe and put our closest ally, Israel, at risk.
Representative Walz.
Well, I asked General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, directly if he considers IRGC a terrorist organization, and he said yes. And we have 600 plus American Gold Star families as a result of their activities, but even during the Iraq War, but even most recently from the attack on Erbil to the attack on Saudi Aramco, to the attack on Jeddah. Without these additional resources, the Iranians are attacking their neighbors or attacking their competitor. And from an energy policy standpoint, for the Biden administration to essentially, and I don't know if Elaine agrees with me on this, but essentially to back away from unleashing American oil and gas, and now to be sending envoys to the Maduro regime, and also potentially entering into this deal at huge cost to stability in the region, to unleash their energy supplies, I think is something we're just going to absolutely have to block and tackle and stop. I think it's just horrible policy conducted by the same team that basically crafted the JCPOA. And I'll just say, as a basic matter, I do not advocate, will never advocate entering into any type of negotiation with a regime that's holding Americans hostage. And that right now, as we speak, Americans are chained to the floor of Evin Prison, including Samiak Namazi, an American citizen who was promised by Zarif to then Secretary of State Kerry to be released as part of the last Iran deal. So I will continue, just on behalf of the families, Eric, to make that point. That should be a precondition of any negotiation, much less sanctions release while they're holding Americans hostage.
We're running low on time, so I'm going to combine two questions, which will be the last question. And I want to say in advance, I want to thank both of you for your time and your candor this morning. One question, which I think mostly will be for you, Representative Luria, is that the 30-year shipbuilding plan that we talked about earlier, which only has one option that gets you to 355 ships, plus the deficiencies that already we know about in our shipbuilding industry and in its capability to maintain and repair vessels. We know that's all inadequate. So how do you think this could be addressed, either through the budget or through other legislation? And then on the issue of deterrence by denial, Deputy Secretary Hicks, at her confirmation hearing, testified that she supported deterrence by denial, and she repeated that last summer in an interview. So what do you make of this? I mean, pulling away from it, is that explicit? I know I want to be careful because I know the NDS that you've seen is classified. I don't want to put people in a position of discussing classified, but is this something that's explicit in the strategy, or is this something that you have concluded upon reading the classified strategy?
I didn't even need to see the strategy. I've concluded it based off of the budget that's submitted and this divest to invest strategy and the fact that we're trying to shrink the Navy when we need a fleet to grow. And we need a strategy to actually carry out defense or deterrence by denial. So I think I could make those comments completely independent of having reviewed the new national defense strategy. And I'm not trying to comment on, any wording used explicitly in there, but, in the public non-classified portion of it, I will say that, all of the messaging has centered around these ideas of integrated deterrence and campaigning rather than deterrence by denial. And, had recently looked back at an article that Kathleen Hicks had written a while back. I think it was in 2020. And I think the title of the article was Getting to Less. If that doesn't tell you anything, just as the title, and it really focused in on the idea that, we needed to expand the range of, what we consider to be defensive measures well beyond what defense spending buys. And I kind of see that idea from her article from about 2 years ago really being clearly played out through her leadership and others at the DoD right now. And then for the second question, I see it's from Admiral Shalansky. So hi, Admiral, that about the not only the shipbuilding, but the ship repair side, and didn't focus in on that a lot today, but it is definitely a focus of mine, as I know it is Mike Waltz now, is ranking member on readiness. We talk a lot about the ship repair side and the industrial base. There is always this preponderance of like, let's look at the newest, shiniest things that we can buy, which I think was mentioned earlier, but you have to be able to maintain those things over the course of their life. And when we're looking at these platforms and we're talking about whether we divest of something today that we could use today, what are the resources that we need to do to modernize, to keep those things viable within this Davidson window, we'll call it, so that they can still come to the fight, and what kind of investments need to be made there. Don't want to get it too into depth, but the SIOP program, industrial-based funding, I'm very supportive of those things that will modernize our shipyards and help strengthen our industrial base. And I'm always looking for opportunities to include more of those resources in DAA and the budget.
Rick, I'll just add Vic quickly. I also support SIOP. I just don't think it's nearly enough.
Right, and it's only the public shipyards. It's not aggressive enough. When they came to us a couple of years ago, remember, Mike, they were like, this is what we could do in 20 years. And we're like, why 20 years?
Yeah.
What can you do in 10? What can you do in 5? And
well, and also, Elaine, that there was no consideration for even more broadly the shipbuilding industry in the bipartisan infrastructure deal.
Yeah.
And Secretary Austin testified that he wasn't consulted on from the administration as the BIF was being formed. So look, at the end of the day, the Chinese are outbuilding us 5-1, and they can obviously concentrate theirs in one ocean. Ours are spread all over the world.
Well, Mike, I would argue that they're trying to, their next goal is to have a permanent base on the west coast of Africa. So, right. Thinking about that, and their base in Djibouti, which can now, base aircraft carriers, think about the entrance to the Red Sea, the Bab el-Mandeb, like Chinese presence there and on the west coast of Africa. I mean,
the agreement in the Solomon Islands.
Think about this window and the new agreement with the Solomon Islands. I mean, they're trying to expand that overseas continued presence.
But I think to your point on repair, we just had a hearing on interim maintenance. And I mean, the Navy admitted, as a result of a GAO report, that they didn't have the data. They really didn't have even a method to collect the data to really drive their interim maintenance. And we have, I think kind of a bit of a crisis with our fleet, in that our sailors are spending longer days and more time ashore than they are, actually afloat. So, I mean, trying to conduct these repairs, and I'm convinced that one of the drivers of the divestment is that we just simply can't get the throughput on our shipyards to keep the things maintained, much less modernized. So it's just easier to retire them. So there's some real industrial base issues. And in full disclosure, I think the ongoing year after year continuing resolutions from our end certainly aren't helpful. Of all the things that they hurt the most, and this is very difficult to explain to our colleagues, because again, they just see the top line figure, which is pretty big. but that money coming in late is devastating to the shipbuilding industry and to the ongoing readiness issues.
It is, and for a
How we
district
fix
like
that one, Eric, I'm not sure.
it was to say, for a district like ours in Hampton Roads, we build all the carriers, half the submarines, and 1/4 of the shipbuilding and repair in the entire country happens here. You can easily explain the impact of a continuing resolution here, but it's hard for us to explain the broader effect. And so it's something that we, continue to battle each year.
Well, on behalf of JINSA, I want to thank Representative Elaine Luria, Representative Mike Waltz for joining us this morning to talk about the budget. I think anybody who's watched this discussion will appreciate the fact that the two of you represent the best of the bipartisan tradition of the House Armed Services Committee. And I want to, again, thank you for both your military and congressional service and ongoing service to the nation. Thank you very, very much.
Yeah, thank you.